I'm Becca with the Happy Ever Crafter, and in this week's tutorial I'm doing some comparisons of different liquid watercolors and how they work with blending your lettering. Let's jump right in. Alright, so these are the different paints that I'm going to be comparing in this video, and I tried to pick similar colors in each different brand. So the first one we have over here is Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus watercolor. These are liquid watercolors, and Dr. P.H. Martin's is known for being like a really high quality product. These are pretty expensive. Then I have, on the other end of the expensive category, I have Artist's Loft. These are liquid watercolors as well, but they're just from Michaels. Artist's Loft is Michaels' brand, and I think these are probably like $3 each or something like that for a huge bottle. And then I have Ecoline. These are by a company called Royal Talons, and these are also pretty expensive, but I tend to really like working with these. And then lastly, I have Cotman watercolor tubes. So these are a little bit different than the rest because they're actually watercolor tubes that you have to squeeze out onto a palette and add water to them, as opposed to them already being in liquid form. So we're going to see how different that is when you're blending. Obviously, we also need watercolor paper. So this is just Strathmore cold press watercolor paper. This is one of my favorites for practice, as well as sometimes for good copies. It's a pretty good quality paper. It's not the most expensive, but it's also not the cheapest. So if you're just playing around, you can get cheaper, but I always recommend cold press watercolor paper. It just has a bit of a grittier texture and it holds the watercolor and the liquid watercolor a little bit better. And then I have a glass of water, and I have a paintbrush. And so this is a Princeton Snap paintbrush. It's just one of my favorite round brushes. Round, it just means like the shape of this brush on the end. And that kind of works really well for watercolor lettering in specific. This is a size 0, but you can use whatever size you want. This is just kind of my comfort zone in terms of the size of the letters I like to do. So for these Ecolines, you can buy them now with a little dropper in them, which is handy, but these ones are just in little jars. So I'm actually going to work right out of the jar for these. I'm just going to dip my brush right in them. But the rest of them I'm going to put in my palette here so that I don't have to, like these are too long to dip my paintbrush into. So I'm just going to put a little bit of each of these into my palette. And then of course for the tubed watercolors, I have to put them in a palette because I have to mix them with lots of water. So just a little dab is fine. You don't need a ton of these. The nice thing about watercolor too is if you put too much in your palette, you can actually let it dry. You don't have to get rid of it afterwards. You can let it dry and then come back to it and re-wet it later and not waste the paint. So I've got all my paint colors in here except for my Ecolines. These ones I'm going to dip right in. And I just need to keep in mind what order these are in so that I don't screw up my testing here. And I'm going to test out each of these colors and how they blend. So first up we have the Ecolines. So I'm going to dip my paintbrush in the water and then dip into my first color, which is this pink. Get it nice and saturated. And my easiest word to blend, I think I'm just going to write the word high. So essentially when you're blending, and I have a full video on this as well if you want to watch it, but you're essentially going to switch colors every time you do a different stroke. So this is my entrance stroke, and that's pink. Then I'm going to dip into the blue and start the stem of my H. Just touch it into the corner. And you'll notice these colors start to blend. Now what you want to keep in mind as you're blending is you want the colors to stay really nice and saturated. And so right before I start my next one, my next stroke, I'm going to wet the bottom where it's going to connect so that when I add my pink, they blend nicely together. Again, making sure that the end of that H is really saturated before I add my next stroke. Dip into the blue and add my I. So that's just a really simple word blended with my Ecolines. So that's pretty much what it's going to look like with those. And one thing to keep in mind is that it always does look a little different once it dries. So we're going to let that dry for a little, and I'm going to move on to the next ones, which are going to be the Artist's Loft. So I'm going to do the exact same blending pattern so that we can compare apples to apples here. So dip into the water, dip into my pink for the entrance stroke. Now, you got to keep in mind that these aren't going to be the exact same shades of each color because they're different brands. And Artist Loft doesn't have quite as many options as the rest of them. So this is the only pink I could find. Then I'm going to dip into my blue. So right off the bat, I can see that the blend doesn't quite do as much of a beautiful bleed as the Eco lines do. So that's the blending with Artist's Loft. Next up is going to be Hydrus. So exact same blending pattern again. Start with the pink. These right off the bat I can tell are a little more pigmented. They're darker and more saturated. And so when that's the case, sometimes you just need to use more water. Okay, so that's Hydrus. And now lastly, I'm gonna do the actual tube watercolors. These are Winsor & Newton. And so for these ones, I need to add a lot of water to them. So I'm just gonna take my brush and add in a bunch of water in here and mix them up. I wanna get it really full of water. So if you have a dropper, you could do that too. You just wanna make sure that they're nice and liquidy like the rest of them. So we're comparing again, apples to apples. So there's my blue, add some water to the pink. You could also change your water in between if you don't want to get them muddied up at all, but I think that for the purposes of this video, it's totally okay. So get them nice and wet, and then exact same thing as the last ones. So starting with pink. And that's it for my 4 different options. So looking at them while they're still wet, you can tell which ones are the most vibrant, which ones are the darkest, which ones are the lightest. And so to me, right off the bat, I can see that my favorite is still the Eco line. I find it's really vibrant, but it also blends really nicely and it's not too dark. Whereas if you look at the Hydrus, it's pretty similar, but it's pretty dark in comparison. So it still blends really nicely. It's beautiful colors. It's really vibrant, but I find sometimes the bleeds get a little bit lost because the pigment is too dark. Then if you look at the Artist's Loft, it still does really pretty blends. It's a great option if you're trying to save a little bit of money because it's still really beautiful, but the colors are a little bit different. They're not quite as rich. And the blends are still beautiful, but it's just not quite the same as the Eco lines. And then lastly, the Winsor & Newton tube paints, you can tell that these are quite a bit lighter. So generally when you're working with tube paints with watercolor, the transparency is a feature that people really like in watercolor. And when you're working and actually doing paintings in watercolor, what you're doing is layering all the time. So with this one, you could always go back over and add more color in later once it's dry and keep layering and adding more. But if you wanted to do it all in one pass, I find the Eco line works the best. Hopefully you found that helpful, and if you want to jump into doing some more watercolor blending with your lettering, make sure you check out this video where I actually show you the step-by-step on how to do it with all your letters. And I'll see you next week.